without the fire, but you can maybe imagine that with our lovely background we have here. And then we will, there'll be an opportunity to have some questions from yourselves. And at the end of our chat, there is an opportunity to purchase the book, Wounded Tigris, and have it signed by Leon over at the back there. So there will be a book signing if anyone wishes to buy a book. Regarding questions, a point on questions is you will have some great questions, I'm sure. As we have a conversation, your curiosity will be primed and prompted. But just a request with questions is to please use a question mark in your question, if you have a question, as opposed to a small mini lecturette where I say, so what was the question? Because then that gets a bit uncomfortable. So if you have anything to say, please use a question mark. But if you need to offer context, then please do. That'd be great. So it is great to welcome Leon here to the festival and have a conversation about his journey and his writing of the book, Wounded Tigris, a river journey through the cradle of civilization. And one of the subheadings to the book, Leon's used the phrase, in search of hope. And I love that as a subheading in terms of the journey and Leon's motivations, and using this idea in search of hope. So, Leon, could you perhaps maybe just start with giving us a summary of the geography of this journey? I don't know when. Well, how many people have been to Iraq? Oh, there's a few folks. Excellent. Yeah. Okay. A few of you have been to Iraq. How many have been to Turkey? Yes, many more have been to Turkey. Okay. Syria? Okay, yeah. A few hands. Okay. Well-travelled bunch. That's great. Great to see. So in terms of geography, Leon, could you give us an overview of where this journey started, where you ended up, and maybe just the geography of the Tigris and the journey you went on? I think that'd be great to start with.
Sure. Well, thank you very much. Firstly, thank you to all of you for coming along and to the festival. It's really wonderful to be here. And it's always really exciting to get an opportunity to talk about these places because all of the countries that this river passes through, and particularly Iraq, are places that have had a huge impact on my life and which I've felt very privileged to get to know and to live in and travel through. But they're also places that are deeply misunderstood, at least as far as I'm concerned. So I love to have an opportunity to talk about them. This river, the Tigris, rises in southeast Turkey in a mountain range called the Taurus. So if you imagine the very southeast corner of Turkey, there's a big city called Diyarbakir. And about 100 miles north of that is the source of the Tigris. It has a sister river, the Euphrates, which you'll probably also be aware of. And they have quite different lives and journeys. So the Euphrates heads off west into central and southern Turkey, then comes down through Syria. Its story is very connected intimately with the story of Syria. The Euphrates and Syria are always bound together. And then it enters Iraq and heads towards the Gulf. The Tigris, which is the river I've written about and spent much of the last 4 years researching, is much more direct. So it comes southeast through the mountains of Turkey, touches a pinched corner of northeast Syria, and then strikes southeast through the heart of Iraq, through cities like Mosul, Tikrit, Samarra, Baghdad, Basra, and all the way to the Gulf, places that, again, might be familiar, at least in terms of their names. And, we're aware of how these places look maybe in a modern-day sense, but what we sometimes forget is just how important they were historically. If we go back to 10,000 BC, 12,000 years ago, our ancestors were living as hunter-gatherers in these caves in the Taurus Mountains and in the Zagros on the Iran side. And beneath them was this huge, vast floodplain through which these two rivers ran. And those hunter-gatherers living in the caves could see the capacity for a great abundance in this floodplain. They could see the flood cycles of these rivers and how they would come through, break their banks, spread silt and alluvium across the plain. And so they slowly began to move down onto that plain, tentatively and cautiously, and experiment with the rivers, experiment with planting crops, with animal husbandry, with cutting irrigation canals and channels. And it was a great success because the ground was so fertile, hence why it's known as the Fertile Crescent now. And so it took 4,000 years for that first step. We weren't particularly quick. But we got braver and we moved further south still on the floodplain over another 4,000 years. And as these experiments got more and more successful, people gathered together in larger and larger groups. And it offered a stability that was never available in the caves in the mountains. And so those groups of people, as they got larger and larger, became the world's first cities, the world's first civilizations. You'll know the names of some of those civilizations like Sumer and Akkad and later Assyria and Babylon. And from those first cities came the first written word, carved into clay tablets, came the first codified legal systems, came the first universities. It's where the first beer was brewed. It's where the first love songs were written. It's where many things that we enjoy and appreciate as part of our lives today came to be. And yet, I think we forget that shared history and heritage with this part of the world. If somebody asks you about Iraq in 2023, you're unlikely to say, oh yeah, the place where the world's first love song was written. You're much more likely to think of 2003 or ISIS or Al-Qaeda or something else. So part of why I wanted to write this book and part of why I love this region is because it's the guardian of a shared global heritage, and it's nice to be reminded of that.
And I think in terms of that history, one of the descriptions of the area is Mesopotamia. So what is that region, and because that's something that comes up, I guess, a lot in historical writing of this area. So can you tell us a little bit about where that comes from and what that describes?
Yeah, sure. Mesopotamia was the name the Greeks gave to this area, which literally means the land between two rivers, so between the Tigris and Euphrates, and led to what we often think of and call it this cradle of civilization, as in it's the place where civilization quite literally emerged. And so throughout history, it's been known for that emergence. There was civilizations in the Indus River Valley as well, around about the same time, and we're not quite sure if the two river valleys were in contact with each other. They probably were, but the Tigris is certainly there at the same time.
Okay, and I mean, you didn't do this on your own. You did this with a team, and I know that team changed depending on where you were on the journey. So if you could tell us a little bit about the team and the selection process, or was it was it selection, interview, was it conversation, and how did you put that team together to decide how you were going to complete this journey?
Yeah, I think, well, I had the idea to travel along the river in 2018 or 19, and I knew it wasn't going to be possible to do it on my own. And the reason I wanted to travel along it was because, I'd been living in Iraq, so I moved to Iraq in 2019. And the reason I moved to Iraq was that I'd been working as a journalist, and I'd traveled to the country a few times, and I'd initially gone to write stories about the city of Mosul in 2016, when it was still under the occupation of ISIS. And that wasn't really my beat as a journalist, and I'd come from the adventure and expedition world prior to that. So it was kind of a pivot for me, but I was writing these stories about Mosul, which was, as you would imagine, very harrowing, very challenging, and I wasn't really sure what my writing was offering to it. And I was traveling back and forth from Mosul, which is in the northern part of Iraq, and the city of Erbil, which is also in the north of Iraq, but which was separated from the war. And after a couple of weeks, I was finished with my story. I was going to go home. And I'd made friends with this young Syrian Kurdish guy called Lawin Mohammed in Erbil. And I told him I was heading home, and he was outraged. He said, you can't possibly go home because all you've seen is war. And war is not what defines us here. And so he said, you're not allowed to leave until you see something else. So he took me to the mountains. And he took me up into the mountains of the Kurdistan region, which were exceptionally beautiful. These huge, deep river valleys and gorges and snow-capped peaks, and it was just incredible, and I had no idea that it looked like that. And I'd actually just written a previous book about the emergence of hiking trails in other parts of the Middle East that reimagined old pathways. And so when I was in these mountains with Lawin, we looked at all these old trails, from hundreds of years, thousands of years ago, pilgrimage ways and shepherd's tracks and old military roads. And we had the idea to develop a long-distance hiking trail in northern Iraq. So we then spent a couple of years. I went back and forth mapping these out with him. The process is very simple. We just wander around and record all the old trails, go to villages, ask where people walked, where they still walked, and if they couldn't remember, ask them where their grandparents walked, where they took the animals, created this big digital matrix of a few thousand kilometers of trail, chose a linear route that made the most sense. And that process took 7 years. It's now finished. It's called the Zagros Mountain Trail. It's not what I'm here to talk about. But if you like hiking and you like mountains, then I suggest northern Iraq is the place for you. So the Zagros Mountain Trail, you're all very welcome to come and join. and I mean that very seriously. But as I was spending all this time in the mountains, I became aware that everything in Iraq was connected to water. Even the rain that fell on us as we were moving through these pathways would eventually drain to a tributary that would go to the Tigris, the Euphrates, and out to the Gulf. So I wanted to do this journey, and I wanted to do it in a way that, initially I wanted to read a book that someone else had written about the Tigris and its deep history and its future, and no one had written that, which was very annoying because I'd spend the next 4 years doing it. But I started to plan it. I put together a team. Emily Garthwaite, very talented British photojournalist in Erbil, signed on at the outset. We spent 2 years, roughly, trying to get permissions. Turns out it's one of the world's most inaccessible rivers, which I didn't know at the beginning. But lots of permits, lots of, not just international boundaries, but internal boundaries as well. But within 2 years, we got most of what we needed. We brought in a filmmaker, Claudio Van Planta, and then we had local companions. So in Turkey, we had 2 river activists and environmentalists, and Angel and Bishar. And in Iraq, we had Salman Kharel and Hana Ibrahim, who were part of these civil society environmental groups. And so it was important to us that we had not just men and women, but also outsiders and foreigners like ourselves, and then people who were going to be tied to the river forever in a way that we never would, so that the book and the research could gather together those perspectives.
Okay, and I mean that subheading to the book, in search of hope. What, in terms of your own motivations, and you've shared that the story of you can't leave, you haven't seen the real part of the country yet. I mean, so I'm interested, in terms of that hope part. What do you feel you were personally connecting with on the journey in terms of that bigger picture hope and sharing that story? Like, what were some of your maybe core beliefs or hopes and motivations around wanting to share the story of the Tigris?
Yeah, I think for me, hope is aspirational. This is a fair warning. You should all read this book, but it's also very melancholy. So, read it, and then it's melancholy, and then there's little bits of hope, and that's kind of life, I suppose. But it's definitely, you have to really squint sometimes to find the hope in Iraq and on the Tigris and with the people I traveled with. But it's aspirational, and all of these people that I worked with and traveled with had hope. And so of course I had to try and embody that and represent that. And I think one of the themes of this book is the challenges that the river's facing, particularly environmentally, the degradation of the river, the damage that's being done to it. We can talk about this maybe in more depth in a bit, but climate change is a part of that, but largely what's happening is just a lack of governance within the countries that share the river. And the people that I was traveling with, the voices that we heard along the river, had hope in the sense that they could see a way to change the system. They could envision a way in which the structures that were in place could be removed and something better could be put in place. And so part of the responsibility of telling the story seemed to be to not just outline very clearly the challenges that the river's facing, but also to point to what those solutions might be. And they're tricky to find. But one thing I would say is that the population of Iraq is probably 40 to 45 million, somewhere like that. It's not entirely clear because there hasn't been a proper census in years, but it's somewhere around that. Half of that population have been born since 2003 and the invasion of Iraq. So it's an incredibly young population. The country's gone through so much in that time and before, but that generation that make up half of the country, they're connected to the internet, they're connected to the rest of the world in the way that their their parents' generation never were. And so they have the ability to see and to try and create a future for themselves that just simply wouldn't have been possible 20 years ago.
Yeah. And when you set about planning to do this journey, and I think for anyone in the audience who's ever sat down and come up with an idea to go on an adventure or a journey or to go and do something, and you start that process of inquiry, investigation, of trying to come up with a plan. I was fascinated when I started to read the book, and I was starting to think about, well, how do you decide that this is a good idea or not? And to most of us who've never spent time in that part of the world, from doing a show of hands, most of us haven't spent time there, so we will have lots of preconceptions about is it safe? Is it feasible? Is this a crazy idea? So I'm quite interested in terms of, what some of those motivations were. And I'd like to just read a couple of lines at the beginning of the book around the responses that Leon got to this idea of doing this journey along the Tigris. It is, of course, an insane undertaking, but those are the only ones worth doing. A second quote was, even if you are not harassed by ISIS, your life will be made miserable by the local authorities. And then a slightly lengthier response to Leon's idea of doing this when he was canvassing opinion and views was, the country, as you are well aware, is a boiling cauldron. For a foreigner to come and sail in a raft, boat, or other kind of vessel would be absolute suicide. Who would guarantee his safety and well-being with all of these criminals and cutthroats having their spheres of influence all over the country? He'd be a sitting duck before he sets his feet on board his boat. Please tell the gentleman that this envisaged adventure should be postponed till much better times come and stay for keeps. So there were some of the responses that Leon got to coming up with this idea. So as a start, it's so I guess I'm intrigued as to the process of having the desire to do the journey, to come up with the idea, canvass an opinion, and I'm sure that's not all of the responses you got, but what compelled you to consider those kind of views and opinions to still want to do the journey, and what was that process like at the beginning to establish whether this was going to be completely insane or actually a level of feasibility to it? Like what was that process that you went through?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think initially the first part was that all of us were in agreement that this felt worthwhile. It felt like an important story to tell, and it felt like we should dedicate ourselves to trying to tell it in the best way possible. Now, my way of telling stories historically was always to go on journeys, to be connected to places, to be immersed in a place. I really like this idea of slow journalism, of the author Rebecca Solnit's got this wonderful phrase of thinking at 3 miles an hour, writing at 3 miles an hour as well as moving at 3 miles an hour. And I've always liked this idea of just kind of being in motion, but collecting stories and ideas and piecing them together and filling in spaces in between. So we were all sold on that, but the practicalities are difficult. And I think this is one of the benefits of living in Iraq during the preparation, was that we could ask as many people as possible. So
were you living in Iraq before you started to do the journey?
Yeah. During the preparation. So I moved there in 2019, and we made the journey in spring 2021. So most of the prep was in Iraq. So I could ask people around us. I could quite literally, put the idea out to people over dinner. I could go to Baghdad. I could go to Basra. I could ask people questions in advance. And then I would ask specialists, and actually the long and eloquent letter that you so kindly read out was from an elderly Iraqi gentleman who'd moved to Amarillo, Texas. I'm not sure why, but he was a cultural heritage expert on Iraq, and someone had put me in touch with him and said, you should really talk to this guy. He's really encouraging. He's very knowledgeable. He's absolutely the guy you need to speak to, and whatever he tells you to do, just do it. And I wrote him a letter saying, I'm going to get in a boat and go down the river, and I got this in response. And we did seriously consider, I don't think any of us were interested in, dying on the river. That was definitely not the ambition. And we weren't really interested in taking undue, silly risks with it, because we had a clear purpose of what we wanted to do. But it also seemed worthwhile trying as much as possible to stick to the idea of being on the river and to, hear the voices from the riverbank. So we balance advice like that, which, although the guy was an incredible expert on the maritime heritage of the river, he'd also been living in Texas for 25 years. Whereas when we spoke to colleagues in Basra or Tikrit or wherever, they would tell us, well, here's the reality. You can travel this section of river, this next section is fragmented or tricky. So it was much of the preparation was in putting those pieces together in a way that felt safe. And I also felt a big responsibility to as Emily and I both in terms of putting this trip together, of keeping everyone safe, because although everyone signed on to it, with a great deal of autonomy, you feel a responsibility to keep everyone safe and return them to their families afterwards, as I'm sure they did for us as well. So, there was a lot of consideration went into that.
Yeah, maybe his view is tainted by his experience of how many people had guns living in Texas. Maybe it was slightly.
Perhaps.
Perhaps. So in terms of the journey, I know you you weren't able to descend the whole of the river by boat. Was that your original intention? Was to do the whole thing by some kind of water vessel, or did you always know that you were going to have to do a combination of water-based and land-based?
No, I had this lovely idea that we would all turn up at the source, which is this beautiful kind of rocky area with all these caves and these Assyrian inscriptions and carvings over the place where the water emerges. I thought we'd go there and we'd design and build our own rafts that mimicked the kind of Assyrian and Ottoman rafts that people used to travel on the river, and then we'd float downstream peacefully and take pictures and write things and do interviews, and then sort of heroically get to the end and everyone would say it was amazing, and that was not even possible for the first mile. So instead we moved to a more realistic model, which is that we essentially hired boats and boat owners along the way, which had the dual benefit of meaning that we were with people who were experts on that section of river, whether it was for a day or 2 days or 3 days, and that worked pretty well. All through Turkey, the Syrian section, it's only about 20 miles, but it's completely militarized by the Turkish government on the other side of the river. The river is literally the international border. So we moved along it on foot on the riverbank on the Syrian side. And then in Iraq, it becomes very fragmented through the different controls. That is sometimes federal government, sometimes militia control. There's also a semi-autonomous Kurdish region in the north of Iraq. And so in those areas, we did listen to advice. We spoke to the military. Sometimes they came in the boats with us, and sometimes, very occasionally, they drove us around areas that were seen to be too tricky. Because some of those areas had been under the control of ISIS until 2016, 2017. Right. So it's still very recent. So we spent quite a bit of time with the soldiers. I think in the end, we did about 70% of the journey on the water, and 30% in other modes of transport.
And in terms of the types of craft, I think you describe in the book the traditional, is it Kelek?
Yeah.
Kelek.
Yeah.
Kelek or Kelek?
Kelek.
Kelek, yeah. And so to share with us, what's that design of that most traditional craft that they've used historically regarding, transport on the river?
Yeah, well, these are, these rivers were always connective devices from the early days onwards, and in the north, close to the headwaters, for thousands of years, people built simple rafts using the materials that were around. So normally the oak that grew in the higher reaches, and they'd make these very simple square rafts, which were called keleks, normally 4 or 5 meters squared. They're Huckleberry Finn style rafts. They're very simple. They've got a little cabin in the middle that you can go to sleep on, and they would carry all the goods from the north. More than that too, they would carry people, they would carry ideas, they would carry religion. They would carry all sorts of things. But just as a trade device, they would carry all these goods down to Diyarbakir, but then down to Mosul, and sometimes all the way down to Basra, which is, the river's almost 1,200 miles long. And when they got to the ends, the boats would be taken apart, deconstructed, and the timber would be loaded onto donkeys and mules and ridden back up the banks of the river so it could start all over again. And so the Assyrians did this. If you go to the British Museum, you can see reliefs showing these rafts from 3,500 years ago. The Ottomans almost industrialized the process from Istanbul of commissioning rafts like this. And there's still some that are in use today. And it was very clever. It was the Assyrians also pressed wine in the north because all the best grapes grew in these higher elevations. And they would send wine down in these rafts to the wealthier clients who lived in the cities along the river further south. And the buoyancy for the rafts was created by inflated goat skins. So they kind of dry these things out, inflate them, tie them off, so they had this shallow draft. But the other good thing about the goat skins was you could load wine from the north into it to take it down to the wealthy clients and keep it chilled as you did so. So by the time these kind of kings and princes and so on in Ashur, in what's now central Iraq, received their wine, it was perfectly chilled.
Sounds very very, very sophisticated way to live.
It was a very sophisticated way to live, yeah. The Assyrians got a lot right. They were also very murderous and rampaging, but they were good at wine.
Yeah. we can't all be perfect, can we? So in terms of you mentioned the start of the journey, how you weren't able to get on the water right at the beginning. But I'm interested how when you have a plan, and there's various versions of this phrase, is that no plan survives the first encounter with reality. You can have all the the best laid plans. So what was maybe just give us a picture of what the first few days or the first week was like, compared to what you thought was going to happen and what you encountered regarding maybe some of the difficulties surrounding permissions and how you were working with the team, and did you have to dramatically change how you thought the journey was going to go just based on that first the first few days or the first week?
Yeah, so the start of the river was southeast Turkey's kind of complex because it's predominantly ethnically Kurdish, and almost 15 million Kurds live in the southeast of Turkey, and a gentle way to say it is maybe that there's a fractious relationship between that Kurdish majority population and the Turkish state, and that plays out in very real ways in the towns and villages that we pass through. So there was often quite a lot of military attention on the river. Turkey's also been doing had a lot of activity on the water, including building a number of dams. The Turkish government had built 22 dams across the headwaters of the Tigris and Euphrates. And this dramatically affects the downstream countries and the populations. So the Turkish government are acutely aware of any journalists who come in and are doing anything related to water. And there was a National Geographic journalist who was detained for a week or two just a couple of months before we were there. So we had to be, aside from just the logistics of travel, we were pretty careful with all of that. So we found our boat owners quite easily, and we moved, but we were pretty agile. We tried to keep our team pretty small. It was always 5 people, and just be able to jump on and off the water at any point. And we did have permits to be there and to film and so on. Claudio, our filmmaker, wasn't allowed to bring his drone into Turkey, which he was very grumpy about for the entire time. Yeah. But I think it was for the best. Okay. It would have attracted much more attention. So the days were just like that, and each evening we'd just discuss what went well and what looked tricky. And as we approached the dams, we had to go around some of them, obviously, because they're secure areas. And and that was the easy part. Yeah, that was easy. It got more complicated in Iraq. But so it was never, if any of you want to have a nice trip down a river, don't go to the Tigris. It's not the holiday for you. But it was worth it for what we were trying to do. It was by far the most complicated thing I've ever attempted in terms of the work I've tried to do. Yeah. But that also speaks to, whatever complications we had on the river are felt 100-fold, 1,000-fold by anyone who lives along it, right? And that was kind of what we were trying to.
You're talking about starting the journey in Turkey. There's a place name in the book which did make me smile, because I've only ever seen this once before, which was from one of the in-flight maps on the back of the seat on an aircraft coming back from somewhere in Asia. And for some reason, it was one of the 5 places mentioned. There's a place called Batman.
That's true.
And it made me laugh on the plane. I was like, wow, there's a town called Batman. And then I hadn't seen it written or heard of it for, I don't know, maybe 10 years. And then I saw it mentioned in your book. So I'm personally intrigued. What happens in Batman?
Batman's a lovely little town. I have a very amusing picture on my phone of a kid reading a comic in Batman, and it's a Spider-Man comic, which constantly makes me laugh. But it's just one of these little towns on the area, and it's got thousands of years of history, right. But it's right by the Tigris, so it's quite an industrial town these days.
Right, okay. Yeah, I was just curious because
no, people don't wear masks and and fight crime.
What happens in Batman? Yeah, who knows where the inspiration came from? Yeah, and you mentioned there about the dams, and I think one of the things that I'm curious about, wanted to ask, was in terms of how dams are constructed and why they're constructed, and the political side of that. Like, what happens on the ground regarding the political relations between 2 countries, where a river is in one country, goes into another country, one country decides to build a dam, there's obviously downstream consequences. So what are some of the dynamics between the countries regarding the consequences of building dams and that whole, I guess that whole topic seems quite complex.
It's very complex. I mean, in theory, in an ideal world, you have an effective bilateral or multilateral water sharing agreement between the countries that share the resources. Many places have that works successfully, and many other places don't. But if you don't, then the power really stays with the upstream neighbors. And so in this situation, and you see this on the Nile too. It's been a big issue recently with the story of the Nile River. But on the Tigris, Turkey has all the control. It has the headwaters of these two great rivers, and Turkey's undergoing water shortages, as are so much of the region, and it's got a growing population. So, since the time of Ataturk, the founder of modern Turkey, there's been discussions, plans to harness the power of these rivers. And in the 70s, the government started to build dams to produce hydroelectric power and to keep these vast reservoirs of water. And so the Iraqi government have never been stable enough or strong enough to create an effective agreement. And you see it really playing out now. I mean, this year, the Tigris received 60% less water from Turkey than it did in 2015. So it's simply not sustainable. No. And there's summits monthly, every quarterly to try and figure this out. But the Iraqi government just have no leverage, and so it constantly fails. I mean, some of the only realistic solutions are really left field ideas. There's a couple of people in the Iraqi government who've suggested admitting their position of weakness and trying to solve it via a simple trade, to trade oil and gas for water, which works economically, but requires the Iraqi government to accept that water that should rightfully be theirs is not. So it's really, really tricky, and Turkey's not in a position where it wants to back down anytime soon.
No, they're not going to. No, they're not for playing in that area. No.
There's no.
And in terms of the river and the part that plays in the well, I guess communities on all sides, but it sounds like there's a bigger impact on the dams when you get into Iraq, I guess, because the majority of the rivers in Iraq, as I understand. So what are communities like around the river in terms of what role is the river playing regarding the communities that you pass through in Iraq, in terms of how they interact with it, the importance of it, where some of the challenges are regarding, you're saying about 60% less water. Like what did you see as you went down the river into Iraq in terms of how the communities?
I mean, the rivers are very simply life, right? I mean, if you look at a satellite map of Iraq, you see brown desert, and then you see these two strips of blue and green that blossoms out from them, and it extends, in this kind of rich, dark, vibrant green, and then as it moves away from the river, it just fades out into brown. So, and the population centers are along that. Population centers just don't survive unless they're connected to the waterways. And there's one story in the book that I write about, because the lower thirds of both of these rivers are very, very flat. So over the last few hundred years, the course has changed slightly. It moves sometimes 20, 50, 100 miles from where it used to be. And there was one place that we visited along the course of the ancient Tigris, so not the modern Tigris, but where it used to go 600, 700 years ago. And there's a city, there was a city called Wasit, which was this, in the Abbasid times, was a great university city, and it was a great place of scholarship. And you can still see the remnants of all these old buildings and all these old gardens and all these old university, the section of the old university. And the story of it is that the river ran through it at one point and furnished everything that grew there. And then over the years, the river slowly moved away, and the city died and turned into desert and dust. And so it's indicative of how reliant we all are on water, but particularly so in this country and in this region. And your question was about what life is like for people along the water. That they rely on it in every possible way. And 80% of Iraq's water goes to agriculture. It's a very agricultural country. It's how people historically have made their living. And so you have these wheat fields, these barley fields. In the south, you've got these marshlands, which were once 7,500 square miles of a completely unique ecosystem in the Middle East, with a place for migratory bird species and fish species, and supported a distinct way of life that was seen nowhere else, with the marsh Arabs who lived on islands of natural material and built these cathedral-like homes out of reeds and kept water buffalo and moved on narrow boats. And all of that is affected because the water level is dropping. It's also much more polluted than it was before, and so it becomes very, very hard to sustain that way of life, which then has all the knock-on implications that you might imagine if you've got hundreds of thousands or millions of people who can no longer live the way they used to.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about that in terms of the condition of the water. I mean, we talk a lot in the UK at the moment about river cleanliness and and how we manage the condition of rivers. What are some of the things that are happening along the river in terms of what's going into the river, and how are people using the water for agriculture or for is it drinking water, and what are some of the impacts environmentally?
Well, the dams have had a huge impact. There's lots of illegal gravel and sand mining operations all the way through Turkey and northern Iraq. But the biggest issue of all is just the lack of governance within Iraq. So everything and anything is being dumped into the river from source to sea. There's no regulation around that at all, at least no effective regulation. So it's highly toxic, particularly by the time it gets to the south, as the flow is reduced and the salt water is pushing back up from the Gulf. It really gets incredibly toxic. The infrastructure for agriculture hasn't been updated in decades, so all of these pipes are ancient and leaking, and farmers are still using methods of irrigation that date back to the Sumerian times, kind of flood irrigation, where they're quite literally flooding fields to grow crops, which is it was fine in the Sumerian days, but 5,000 years ago, but now it's very wasteful. And in order to upgrade to drip irrigation or something like that, they just need a small investment or subsidy from the government, which is not forthcoming. So a lot of this just comes down to the fact that the government has been unwilling or unable to support the changes that need to happen. And there's lots of reasons for that. I mean, the Saddam Hussein's government was brutal and murderous and had no care for his people. But after 2003 and the invasion, the public services and the infrastructure in Iraq was completely stripped away. Everything was gone, and it just left this huge void, and that's kind of what Iraq's been dealing with ever since. So it hasn't been possible since that time to put a system in place that helps protect people and helps protect the environment. But there are also hope. Yeah. Before anyone gets too depressed. There is hope, and it comes through these young people and through these young civil society groups who are quite literally taking these matters into their own hands. There's one organization called Nature Iraq, founded by a guy called Azam Al-Wash, who after 2003 went back and he kind of led. So these marshes that I mentioned, which had been there for 5 millennia, disappeared in the 80s and 90s because Saddam Hussein drained them as part of his effort to go to war with Iran. Quite literally drained 90% of the marshes and destroyed them, destroyed the way of life and the ecosystem. And after 2003, Azam and many of the marsh Arabs returned and reflooded the marshes and brought life back miraculously, a kind of phoenix from the ashes moment. And it wasn't quite the same. They're about half the size they were before and half the species and half the population, but they came back. And it was incredible, and it was a very emotive and hopeful moment for Iraqis. And so you have organizations like that. You've got the guy Salman that we traveled with. His NGO, Hamad Dijla, they've got a network of grassroots environmentalists in every town and city along the river, each of whom not just documents the environmental degradation of the river, but they also run programs, educational programs around river protection. They run litter pickups for university and school students. So it's all of the best and most hopeful things in Iraq are happening at that grassroots level. It's people saying, screw this, we're not going to put up with this anymore, and taking it into their own hands.
Yeah, and you mentioned a couple of times the Gulf War of the early 2000s, and you mentioned Saddam Hussein. I'm intrigued as a Westerner doing this journey, what your experiences were of how you integrated with the people, because travel from a visual perspective can be wonderful, but I think often one of the things that really brings it to life is the interaction with the people in the countries that you visit or travel within. So I'm interested what were some of the dynamics like in terms of the people you met and that relationship post Gulf War in terms of how you were perceived as a Westerner, and and I'm guessing you visited some places that probably don't see many Westerners coming through. So I'm just what were some of the experiences you had regarding that?
It's a good question. I'll tell you one thing first, which is that when I started traveling quite late. I grew up, in a farm in Ireland, and I didn't really travel anywhere outside of Ireland and the UK until I was in my early 20s, which probably particularly for people in this room, and it's quite late. And on one of my first ever long haul flights in my early 20s, I was in Doha in the airport, in this long line of people. Everyone was delayed, and I got chatting to these two guys in front and behind me. And the guy in front of me was from Somalia, and he talked about growing up in Mogadishu and the great food and all the great memories he had of his family and all these wonderful things. And the guy behind me was from Yemen. He spoke about Sana'a and this wonderful city and the architecture and the mountains and all the things he missed. And after about half an hour, one of them asked me where I was from, and I said, I'm from Northern Ireland. And they both took a noticeable step back, and the guy from Somalia said, isn't that terribly dangerous? And I think of this a lot because, the beauty of travel, as so many of you in this room will know, is that as we do it, our preconceptions vanish in front of our eyes. Mm. And the world that I step out into and have done for the last 15 years is so much more good and kind and hospitable and beautiful than I could ever have imagined, and certainly than the one that I see from a distance on the news. And so it's the beauty and privilege of this job. And what I find when I go places is that my preconception is, even when I think I'm, educated and less ignorant about places, it's still always wrong. And when I travel through Iraq, I've never had a negative encounter of being perceived as connected to the decisions of Western governments or militaries that have caused harm in the past. I think maybe if you took Tony Blair or George Bush and dropped them into Crete today, maybe they'd have a different experience. Yeah. We could try it. But
I think it's a good idea.
Yeah. But for me, no. I mean, and there's lots of, occasionally people will have fun with it. I mean, Iraqis, there's a great sense of humor in the country. They'll often make jokes about it, but it's never negative. And it's kind of an amazing thing to go through all of that and still not have any animosity to someone who represents a government that did so much harm to your country.
That's quite a thing.
It's an amazing thing, yeah.
That's quite a thing. I know I did write down one quote that I read in the book when you said you were talking to a Mukhtar. A Mukhtar is a...
like a local mayor.
Local mayor, yeah, talking to a Mukhtar in one of the towns, and I guess this was prompted my question about attitude to Westerners, and when you said where you were from, he said, Britain, they are the best. The sun always shines on the empire, which I thought was quite a remarkable... I won't ask for a hands up who agrees on that one. I just thought it was quite a remarkable thing to hear, considering the history in the past, and
I think the British military had given them a lot of money and guns at some point in the past.
Okay, that explains it.
That helps in the general.
That probably helps, yeah. So in terms of the journey, I'm guessing it wasn't completely straightforward and like some river cruise holiday on the Nile or something. So how was it physically and emotionally? Because what was the total duration you were on the journey?
We were on the river for about 3 months.
About 3 months, yeah. Right.
Yeah.
So physically and emotionally, what was the roller coaster that you experienced?
It was hard. It was really, really hard. I mean, it was harder than a lot of the more physical expeditions I did when I was younger. I think it's because it was a very physical thing, even though we weren't paddling ourselves or maybe walking, as far as I would have done in the past. But we were constantly on the move. We started in winter, kind of end of winter, early spring in 2021. So it was very cold. We finished in 50 degrees Celsius in Basra, in the Gulf. But also just, I suppose, and I'm always hesitant to say this because I kind of dip in and out, and I can leave, so it's always a bit different for me. But in comparison to the people who I was with and talking to, but it's emotionally draining. Every single day we heard stories of trauma, whether that's from the waves of conflict, or whether it's the environmental situation, or whatever else, and you hear 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 of those stories a day, and it really mounts up. So it weighed on us pretty heavily. It took a long time I suppose to be honest about it, it took a long time to recover from that, and the book was quite cathartic in a way of writing that out, and also finding that balance of, the river provided that in a natural way too. You would have that, and then you would have these moments of hope and joy and optimism and incredible hospitality. We carried our tents along because we thought we would camp on the riverbank most nights, and every time we tried to put up our tent, someone from the village would just come over and shake it and go, "What are you doing? You're idiots. Come to my house instead." And so we'd be, taken inside and fed, and so there was so much of that went alongside it, and I think for all of us who were on the journey, it took months or a couple of years really for all of that to settle, and find an equilibrium with what we were trying to do and how we felt about it, and what we wanted to do with the story that we'd heard.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned a couple of times that that hospitality of people and being surprised by maybe a lack of responsibility for what happened with the West. But in terms of the people you met, I guess there's a couple of questions. Is what most surprised you about any interactions you had with the people on that journey, and what do you think will stick with you for the rest of your life in terms of an interaction you had with somebody?
What'll stick with me? It still is this river of antiquity, right? You still get this sense of what it used to be, and there are the most amazing places and remnants of the past that are still on the Tigris. There's still a minaret from a mosque from the 9th century called Malwiya, which is about 170 feet high. It's this kind of snail shell design that's very iconic. You might have seen pictures of it. And it's endured through all of this, and there's a community who still live around it. There's the site of Ashur where the Assyrian Empire emerged, with a 4,000-year-old ziggurat, which is this kind of base of a temple built out of 6 million mud bricks. And much of that site around it has never been excavated. 85-90% of it is still under the ground. So 11 archaeologists manage this site and hundreds of others, and quite literally, guardians of this antiquity that's all underground. So interactions like that with this one particular guy, Salim Abdullah, who's the guardian of the site of Ashur, that will stick with me forever. Particularly when he said to me, the Assyrian Empire were one of the most powerful empires the world had ever seen, from 800, 700 BC. Throughout their hundreds of years in power, there was 120 Assyrian kings. The tradition stated that each king would be brought back to be buried at Ashur. They found 3 of the graves, and in each of those graves that they found, there was monumental architecture, these big winged lamassus, or there was gold or jewels or figurines. And he said, "Where are the other 117? Well, they're still there, but there's just never been enough stability or investment or sometimes interest to excavate them." So I think stuff like that will stay with me forever. It's why I really hope that at some point, there is real scientific archaeological excavations that start to bring these treasures to the fore, and that Iraq has enough stability for us to see that, and that those people who've looked after those sites as they've been overworked and under-resourced get celebrated. So I just it's being a journalist is wonderful in many ways, and I sometimes wonder, my job is essentially going around asking people to tell me stories, and then I just write down their stories and I put it in a book, and and then everyone reads my book, and I think, what did I do? Apart from just synthesize those stories. But it's that's the thing that I love, is it's just such a unique and special position to be in, to get to hear all of these wonderful lives that are being lived, even amidst hardship and challenge, but people who are trying to build something better for the future.
It sounds like a journey of perspective, and realigning some of our belief systems. I guess that would be how I'm interpreting it. I'm sure your curiosity has been prompted by what you've heard so far. So, yeah, I think we've got time for a couple of questions from the audience. Yeah, there's a hand there. Nice and loud, please. Yes.
I'm interested in hearing your perspective on how sort of the increasing scarcity of water might have contributed to some of the instability in the region and interacted with those conflicts that have happened.
I'll repeat the question because people won't be able to hear it. Just can you say it a little bit louder? Sorry, I didn't quite hear it myself.
How water scarcity may have contributed or interacted with some of the instability in the region.
Okay, how does water scarcity influence instability in the region?
Heavily and increasingly so. So, people are reliant. It's the most important resource they have. They're incredibly reliant on it, and the resource is diminishing. And so, on a local level and a broader level, what we're seeing now, particularly in Iraq, is people being pushed into conflict with one another. And families who live along an irrigation canal that comes off the Tigris, the people at the end of that are no longer receiving water, and the people at the start of it are just receiving enough for their share. So the family at the end and the family at the start of that are being pushed into a conflict with one another. And sometimes it's resolved peacefully, and other times it's not. But you extrapolate that out, and that's what you're getting. And 1 in 15 families in Iraq has seen a family member move and leave a historic way of life because of water shortages in the last 5 years. Iraq is losing arable farmland about 30, 40 square miles a year in the last 5 years. So it's really not sustainable. Those people are starting to move. They're moving from the rural areas into the cities. That's putting more pressure on the cities like Basra and Baghdad, which can't handle them. So there's more potential conflict there, and there's more movement, and people move up the river, and you can kind of see where that goes, right? It's causing a mass displacement of people, and we're at the front end of that, but it's happening in real time.
Thanks for the question. Another question. Okay, we'll go here at the front.
You've spoken a lot about talking to all the locals who you met along the way. So I was just wondering if you speak Arabic and or Turkish, or if you had to use an interpreter, and what that was like.
Do you speak Arabic or Turkish, and what was the use of interpreters along the way?
Yeah, so one of the roles of the team that we had, Angel and Bishar in Turkey, was that Angel is also an interpreter. I don't speak Turkish. I speak some Kurdish because I've lived in a Kurdish city for 4 years. I've been learning Arabic for 5 years, so I can get by, but I also had Salman and Hannah, who would also be interpreters. But we had, Turkish, 2 or 3 different dialects of Kurdish. We had a Syriac language, plus different dialects of Arabic, so it changes quite significantly as we pass through. But because of working in the region, I've been learning Arabic mostly, and a little bit Kurdish.
Are they quite different?
Yeah, completely unrelated, unfortunately.
Right, okay. Well done. Okay, another question. I think, yes, here.
You mentioned at the end about you being the person that essentially gets people to tell you stories. And I was wondering if there's anything that you try to look out for when you're telling other people's stories, and if you think that is there a right way and a wrong way to do that, or is there anything that you try and avoid when you're telling somebody else's story?
So the
good practice ways to do it.
A question about best practice of sharing other people's stories in terms of what do you look out for when you're engaged in those conversations with a view to sharing the stories?
Yeah, thank you for that. That's a really important question. It's challenging when writing a book like this. I record and report all the stories in the same way, which is just the details of the conversation. But I try and in a book especially, I try and tell stories and make sure, of course, I'm quoting people directly and accurately. I try and be generous in the way that I describe people, and I make sure that everyone I'm writing about is happy for me to write about them. And I go through different stages of that process as the book gets closer to publication. Same for other stuff I write. And it has happened a few times where I've written something and take it to people and they say they changed their mind and don't want to be written about, and in a book like this, it's important to me that people are happy to be included, because I'm not, because I'm trying to include them as part of this. So people do it in different ways, but that's kind of my process. I want to make sure that I have something that people are happy to be included in, even if their inclusion is complaining about the government or complaining about. I also want to make sure people don't get in trouble for anything I've articulated that they've said.
Because I know you did say in the book that some of the people you spoke to, you've changed their names and locations.
Yeah.
I mean, was that fairly important regarding how you shared those stories?
Yeah, it wasn't very many people. Most people were quite happy, but there's 2 people in particular who needed to be moved to a different location in the book because of what they'd said and because of the connections they held where they actually were, and there was maybe 3 or 4 who wanted their names withheld. And those are people who are just were generally had a critique of the situation or how they find themselves. Or there was one guy, a young guy who kind of didn't want his parents to hear his story, so he changed his name, because he said his parents were terrible people. That was why.
Okay, another question. We've got time for another question. Okay, hand at the back there, yeah.
You took a photographer. Did you consider turning it into a documentary?
Yeah, so...
I'll just repeat. Yeah, you took a photographer. Did you say photographer or videographer? Photographer. Have you considered turning this into a documentary? And actually, did you do sustained video throughout as an extension to that?
Yeah, so we had 3 of us as the international contingent. I was writing a book. Emily was taking photographs. She's got an exhibition opening next week, I think, in London with her work from this. And Claudio Von Planto is our filmmaker. Claudio's an incredible filmmaker. He's been around for ages. He's done a couple of things. He was the first person to get a filmed interview with Osama bin Laden. He went off into the mountains in Afghanistan to film him, which I think is what he should be remembered for. He's also quite well known because he was the filmmaker on a TV series called Long Way Round with Ewan McGregor and Charlie Borman. If you remember, there was a Swiss guy on the 3rd motorbike who kept losing his passport and was a bit of a lovable liability. That's Claudio. And he's still exactly the same. So Claudio came and shot the whole thing. And my book was commissioned beforehand. Emily's exhibitions were commissioned beforehand. We didn't have a commissioner for the film. We kind of shot that on spec. And we haven't sold it yet. So that's basically the story. We have all the footage. We've cut a version of it, but we're still trying to find a broadcaster or a home for it, or some kind of wonderful film festival that meets in the Lake District every year. Hopefully at some point we'll get that concluded.
Yeah. And a couple of questions just to close. I'm just aware of time. You mentioned your history of maybe being more adventure focused in the earlier part of your career. Where do you see the importance of combining travel and adventure and journalism and sharing stories? Like, where do you see the importance of the future in that as a focus for, I guess, both for you personally, but also, within the travel and adventure world that we're part of this weekend?
Yeah, well, I think weekends like this are just incredible because it brings together all these people who love and value the same thing, which is why I love being here. I think this intersection of journalism and storytelling with adventure and exploration is really exciting and really important. And I'm certainly not in the business of ever giving advice because I'm not very good at taking it. I don't really have anything prescriptive to say about it. But I do think it's a really powerful way to tell stories, to combine the humility of very simple human-powered physical travel with something really purposeful, and we live at a point in time where it's pretty important to be purposeful, and especially for those of us who love the natural world and the people who inhabit it. There's so much that's wonderful and diverse and beautiful about it, and there's so many challenges that it's facing, and to try and combine all of those elements is I think it's really powerful. It's a good way to draw people into stories that they might not otherwise hear. So that's kind of why I like the technique. Yeah.
Okay, and my last question is: we started with hope, and so maybe it feels fitting to end with hope from this conversation. So what are your hopes for the future for the Tigris and, I guess, the country of Iraq, where you're currently now based?
I think simply that those civil society groups, those young people, have the opportunity and have the support to create a different vision of the country from what we've seen in the last decades. And, you know, Iraq doesn't, a lot of that has to come internally. Iraq certainly doesn't need any more unsolicited Western military interventions, but it does need supporters, and it needs people who value the work that's been done, and it needs stories being told about what a fabulous, beautiful place it is, and not just a place that's been conflicted for decades. So I think there is hope. We've got to cling on to it and, yeah, tell people the story of the Tigris.
Thank you, Leon.
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Leon. A fascinating adventure. Thank you all for coming. Thanks to Cotswold for sponsoring the book festival. The book signing over in the corner. If you like a book, Leon's going to be around for the next 10, 15 minutes or so. Enjoy the rest of the festival. Thank you very much.